when you issue shares for cash is you increase cash and you increase equity value by increasing stock or common stock. However, if there is a registered value or par value registered with the government or with the stock exchange, instead of having one credit or increase to equity value called stock, you have two equity value accounts that are increased. Stock or common stock is increased by the par value, and the rest of the cash that you receive, the rest of the increase, goes into paid-in capital. So if there is no par value, there is no paid-in capital because you simply increase cash and increase the value of the stock. The answer, therefore, is not cash or stock because they do get increased. The answer is paid-in capital. Next up, whether I get cash when I issue stock, or someone says to me, I don't have cash, I'll give you equipment instead, the increase to equity value is not impacted. The only thing that is impacted is instead of getting an asset called cash, you're getting an asset called equipment. And so it's only the increase to the asset or the debit to the asset that changes. Okay, next up, it's a special two-part question. The preferred shareholder is supposed to get $5 a year. In the first year, Sasha says, I only have $3 to give. The preferred shareholder says, then give me those $3. Common stockholder gets nothing, and you still owe me $2 going into next year. Next year comes around. The preferred shareholder says, you still owe me $2 from last year. You owe me another $5 for this year. The preferred shareholder says, you owe me $7. Do you have $7? And in year 2, Sasha says, I have more than $7 to pay. I have $8. At which point the preferred says, give me the $7 that you owe me, leaving $1 for the common shareholder. Therefore, 7 and 1 is the answer to that next question. Finally, for any kind of stock dividend, whether it's a sort of a normal dividend, you're issuing new stock, or you have a special type of stock dividend called the stock split, because there is no asset being impacted, and because there is no liability that is impacted, there is no change to the equity value of the company. That concludes the review of the first quiz. Questions about that? Okay, on to the second quiz. Second quiz, debt, long-term debt at that. Whenever you see the word bond, it means that the lender is thinking about and may, and in today's climate, probably will sell the debt to someone else. And remember, what you're actually selling is a note receivable on one side and a note payable on the other side. However, as soon as you see the word bond as opposed to note, note receivable or note payable means there's some kind of written contract, hence the word note. The word bond, whether receivable or payable, means that the lender is thinking about and probably will sell that debt to someone else who will buy it. Coming up next, and actually this is true of the remainder of the questions, it's all about the S&P and Moody's question, illustration, I should say, in the textbook. So you have two categories of bond ratings. They are investment grade, which is the better one, and junk, which is the worse one. The worst of the investment grade, so that's the worst of the better one, grades is called minimum investment grade. However, minimum investment grade, which is the worst of the top half, is better than anything in junk, which is why minimum is lower than medium or high investment grade, but it's actually better than speculative, which is part of junk. Even though there are some people who invest in very risky transactions, even though those people, private equity investors, venture capitalists, angel investors, hedge funds, sometimes you'll hear them say, well, I like more speculative investments, more risk, more return. That's true. There's nothing wrong with thinking that way. But in terms of bond ratings, which is what this chapter is all about, very speculative is worse than speculative, meaning that you need to be more worried about getting repaid if you own the debt, if something is ranked very speculative. And finally, D as a bond rating is used by one of the rating agencies and not the other. It is the absolute, absolute, absolute worst grade you can get based on that one rating agency. It's like getting a D minus, a D minus that does not count as passing because you need to get at least a C, and you might think, why am I even getting a D minus? I mean, either give me the D or give me the F. That is how some teachers and programs think. Others say, no, a D minus is a perfectly reasonable grade. If you earn it, you get it. Okay, let me not dwell on terrible grades. But anyway, there is a bond rating D, which is in this world the worst of the worst. One of the rating agencies uses it, the other one does not. And that concludes my brief discussion of the answers. Any questions about the answers? Okay, any questions about the subject matter of equity or the subject matter of what we discussed this far on chapter 14? Going once? Going twice? And okay, that concludes our discussion of the quizzes. This also is our second go around on exploration of using video. As always, I had a little bit of qualms about introducing the complexity of having a video supplement to my usual class. Complexity always means greater risk that something can go wrong. In addition, I had the bandwidth constraints on uploading things, video files directly to files. I seem to have gotten around it by uploading it to Instructure, which is an account that all faculty have with the parent company of Canvas. Most don't realize that. I'll see how you guys did on this quiz on equity today. So far, though, from what I can tell, there's no downside to using video in this matter, either from an administrative perspective or from a teaching perspective. But if you feel that the use of videos either significantly improved or significantly made worse, needlessly complicated the teaching and learning experience for you, by all means, shoot me an email message. Do let me know, or you can hang out after class and we can chat about it a bit. What I was aiming for was it should not make things significantly worse, of course. If for some students it didn't seem to make much of a difference one way or the other, and for other students it made a significant benefit, then it probably was worth the effort in terms of the additional complexity. Okay, so that's what I was thinking of regarding that. We are continuing to proceed through our final chapter of the class, which is great. We are also quickly coming up upon the 20th of our 20 quizzes. Now that's excluding the 4 extra quizzes. Um, in theory, it would be great if the final quiz of the final textbook material was exactly chapter 20. It's usually off by a quiz this way or a quiz that way. So it's possible that the final quiz on the final chapter on the textbook will be chapter 20. It might be, I'm sorry, quiz 20. It might be quiz 21. My point is that, roughly speaking, we will have, let's say, 3 or 4 quizzes to go, and we will be done with the textbook. There are always some students who say, Mike, I'm looking at what my final course grade looks like given the 20 quizzes that I've taken. And we're basically done with the textbook. So in terms of covering the basics of the information in the class, do I need to do anything else? And I will respond, no, not really. I mean, the only exception is that some of you might have scholarship implications where, for scholarship purposes, or you might have some kind of visa, like you're a global student and you have visa implications involving my need to report attendance. And so if there are attendance issues, you do need to keep in mind that I am using the quizzes to capture attendance. But if that doesn't apply to you, then there's no reason for you to continue. Now, a lot of students, and I understand this fully, say to me, that just doesn't feel right. I mean, this is the time of the semester when I'm gearing up, when things are at their most nightmarish. And this is supposed to be, a grind it out, weeding out kind of class. How can you be telling me with like 3 weeks left that I'm good to go with the grade that I feel comfortable with? And the answer is you're finally getting to the point in the semester where, if you're in this position, you can see the benefits of a distributed, and actually a highly distributed, system of value. If you know anything about Bitcoin, the main benefit of Bitcoin, some people will say, is that it's based on a technology called blockchain. And the main benefit of a technology called blockchain is it's very highly distributed. It works on thousands and eventually perhaps millions of servers all over the planet. And so if something goes wrong on a good number of those servers, the other servers are there to basically pick up the slack. Here, I've taken, just based on the structure of the class, the point value of your grade, your course grade, and highly distributed it over pretty much every day that we've met this semester. And so if nothing has really gone wrong for you at all this semester, you're not imagining things, you shouldn't feel uncomfortable. You do not need to do any more work this semester as long as attendance is not a problem. Now, my final point is, okay, but if we're still having 24 quizzes Basically, we're still meeting through the end of the semester. What will we do if there is no textbook? And I always smile at that when people ask me that. It's a perfectly rational question, but it makes me smile because there is learning that is possible beyond the textbook. you know, um, thank God and thank God for that. And so the learning will continue. We only have a few sessions, a small number of sessions after we wrap up the textbook, but it will be an applied case-based learning activity that extends beyond the textbook. Um, okay, so that I just wanted to mention that because as you can imagine, some of those questions have been swirling around. I've been getting asked that. They're perfectly reasonable, but I thought I would address it with all of you, in a few minutes this morning. Any questions about that? And okay, so for now, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's go back into the textbook. Let me share screen. And you should see the textbook on the screen right now. I will go into our content notes, put that down on the side. We've worked our way through 14-2 bond ratings. Let me take us back to 14-4, bonds sold at discount and subsequent journal entries. 14-4. Okay, 14-4 is a little unusual because it doesn't begin. See, here's illustration 14-4. It doesn't begin with your usual ugly beige box. It actually begins with white background, and then it goes into the ugly beige box. But what does it begin with? It begins with a $700,000 loan where there is a series of interest payments of $42,000. It looks like the interest payments are being made every 3 months from 2024 through 2026. So it's a 3-year loan. It's a $700,000 loan. There are $42,000 of interest payments made every 6 months. The present value of just the interest payments is $200,195. The present value of the principal itself, which you have to repay at the end of the loan, is $466,000. So the present value of all of the future cash flows is the sum of these two numbers, 666, 633, is the present value of the debt at the beginning of the loan at that moment. Now, the reason why, and as you know, I am not always a fan of the textbook author, but I actually like the way he began illustration 14.4 as opposed to 14.3, where he basically said, well, the first thing that you want to do to compute the 666, 633, well, actually, this is a rounding difference. He has it as 666, 634. In this previous illustration, he says, well, obviously you want to use a calculator or use the PV function of Excel, and you punch numbers into cells, or you punch these numbers into this one PV formula in Excel, and voila, you get your answer. The present value is 666, 634. I don't like doing it that way. I like computing present value this way. Now, by the way, if you do it this way, you probably need access to a spreadsheet because it's really hard to do it this way and to keep track of all the little 42s and, present value each one. It's really hard to do that on like a handheld old-fashioned calculator. And it's really, really hard, as you can imagine, to do the math calculations by hand. But also keep in mind that, you know, if you just have any kind of a smartphone, I mean, let's say you have an Android phone, you can just log on to the free version of Microsoft Excel, or actually, I think there is an Excel app, and have a tiny little spreadsheet on your cell phone. With Apple, I'm not sure if there is a Microsoft Excel app that works on Apple, but Apple does have its own version of a spreadsheet that works for free, and you can access it on an Apple iPhone. And of course, if you have a laptop computer with you or a desktop computer, you can just open your normal spreadsheet program. The reason why I really like this, and if any of you are in real estate and real estate sales, or actually if any of you have ever worked for an automobile dealership or a truck dealership, this happens all the time. Yeah, you get your principal, and yeah, you get your interest, and there are charges, right, that you have to pay. And then suddenly you say, well, wait a minute, what's this charge? And the dealer or the realtor says, oh, that's a charge for something which you may or may not want, which you may or may not need, which they may imply when they talk to you. They'll imply that it is somehow required by the bank if you're taking out a loan, or they'll imply, oh, by the way, that charge is required by law. But that doesn't mean they're telling you the truth. Now, there are some charges that are required by law. For instance, for certain types of motor vehicles, if I have a particular type of van or truck or even car, and if I'm telling my dealer, I'm giving you the car for a trade-in value to be applied against the purchase of my new car, there is often a charge for disposal of the tires, TIRES, because the rubber tires are basically they look to us like they're just rubber tires, but you do have to dispose of them carefully or else they can do damage to the environment. There can also be special charges legally for the disposal of the battery in the engine because the battery fluid is actually a toxic chemical. And so what happens is these charges, some of which you pay or you don't pay, they're flying around in the real world. And as a result, what you have to say whenever you're in these negotiations is, okay, what are these charges? And when do I have to pay them? And do I have to pay them at all? And even if I don't have to pay them, but I agree to pay them, do I have to pay them up front or can I pay them sometime in the future? And the only real way to keep track of all of that is to lay out a little spreadsheet like this. And when you add up the present value of all of the cash flows that you're going to have to pay upfront or eventually, and you come up with the present value of the future cash flows, and it's usually a string of numbers for interest. It's usually one or at least a small number of principal repayments. But then you have all these little items usually. You don't see them in this illustration, but you have all these little items, various miscellaneous charges, and they could string out for the life of the transaction. And they might be all over the place in terms of what the numbers are, but they can add up. And the only way to say, hey, bottom line, what do I have to pay you? When do I have to pay it to you? And the present value of all of those cash flows is computed right here in this calculation. Usually more than 2 rows, because you have at least a third row for all kinds of other charges and fees. They add up to your total. Okay, so let me stop for a moment. Any questions about that? Okay, that may actually be the most valuable thought that I can share with you, at least for the items that we're covering today, maybe even the most valuable thought for the entire chapter. Because, as you can see, I note subsequent journal entries, make sure that you understand them as well. Okay, you want to be in the position where you say, journal entries, what are they? Well, if at the end of this negotiation, you look at the automobile dealer and say, look, the present value of all the future cash flows is 666, 633. This thing that I am buying is worth 666, 633. And therefore, if I am taking out a loan to buy this car from you, the loan should be 666, 633. And yes, I realize that I am getting the cash and then turning right around and giving you the cash to buy the automobile or the truck or whatever it is. But basically, the loan itself should be 666, 633. Now, I know you're thinking 666,000, that's a really expensive automobile. So maybe I should be speaking about a small real estate building, or maybe a condo, some condominium, something like that. Okay, so how does it work? Well, what actually happens is, and let's just go down here for the moment. The person who is buying the building, right, is taking out a loan for 666, 633. Increased liability by debiting, increased liability by crediting a payable, 666, 633. Debit cash, because there's a moment when you first sign up for the loan. In that moment, you actually have cash for 666, 633. Increase liability, increase asset. In the very next moment, you then spend the cash to buy the asset, whether it's a truck, a car, a building. And so in that very next moment, you credit cash and debit building or condominium or automobile. But in terms of the debt transaction, credit liability, debit cash, it's that easy. The lender who is paying you the cash and expects you to pay them back because it is a loan is crediting or reducing cash because it's giving you the money so that you can buy the asset. The debit to the investment is actually a bond receivable. Okay. And actually, the author himself wrote in one of the little blue text items that we read a couple days last week, I guess, the bond payable and the bond receivable are basically part of the same transaction. They're twins, if you think of it. You could call the asset investment in bonds. And I think the only reason why the author likes to call it investment in bonds as opposed to bond receivable is because he wants to make a point of saying, if you see the word bond, you're probably going to sell the receivable to someone else. And so you're not thinking about the debt as, I'm a bank, this is my banking customer, I care about this person, I'll be dealing with them as a banking customer for the long term. Instead, you have a receivable on your books, but you don't intend to hold on to it for a long time. You don't intend to deal with this person for a long time. You'll probably be selling that receivable in the near future. You're just thinking of it as a very short-term investment. Okay. Any questions about this pair of entries? I went to this first because this is what I always see as the appropriate entries. The textbook author, as he always does, or often does, says, let me make it a little more complicated. Instead of simply crediting bonds payable for 666, can I have two different liability accounts, a regular liability account and a contra liability account, where the two of them netted against each other is 666? And as always, at this point, hopefully you're thinking, okay, Mike, I remember this drill. We've been through this before. Sure. You can take what, simply put, is a regular liability balance of 666. And if you want, you can have two different liability accounts, one of them being a contra account, and the two of them netted against each other, added together in total, can equal 666. But this is a liability and a contra liability. And the two of them together is basically what I would think of as the net liability. Similarly, if you took investment in bonds, which is an asset, it's really a note, I'm sorry, a bonds receivable. It's a receivable. Can you split it between, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to highlight. I'm not trying to make it complicated. There we go. Let me extend, perfect, okay. Can you take the receivable, which is really 666, and can you divide it between a receivable and a contra receivable account? Sure. The simpler way, which is what I usually see, is just use one account. Now, the funny thing is the author, sometimes, as you know, often in the past, the author never acknowledged that in the real world, simpler is better. And we just go with one account in terms of two instead of two. Here, the author writes, he presents the more complicated way first. And he writes, a sometimes used alternative way is to use what he calls the net method, in which the contra account is included in the main account. Indeed. So I'm glad that he acknowledges that using one account is just as acceptable as using two accounts. He does not get into my explanation, which is one is less complicated than two and therefore is preferable. But at least he shows you both of the different approaches, and he does acknowledge that both, or that each, are equally acceptable. Okay, questions about this calculation? The point that I was trying to make, which is at first glance, the calculation does not look like a spreadsheet, but it really is at second glance. And there can be a pragmatic benefit to using it in the real world, as opposed to the typing numbers into a calculator or into an Excel single cell. And then finally, any questions about the journal entry? Questions? Okay, good, good, good. So next up is illustrations, or are illustrations 14.7 and 14.9. And these you've already seen. I'm just touching upon them briefly to show these are no different than what you would normally use. So let me go to 14-9 first. So 14-9 is an example where the author has taken the present value of future cash flows and he has said, well, what do you know? This $700,000 loan or liability has a present value that is more than 700. It's 735. Interesting. Back here, the $700,000 loan has a present value that is less than 700. It's 666. Is there a pattern here? Yes, there is. And I don't think you actually see this in the textbook at all. So I'm going to be a little annoyingly repetitive. Forgive me for doing this, but I'm going to say the same thing 3 times. You might want to write it down. Rule. You're really dealing with 2 different interest rates. There is the interest rate, hold on. There is the interest rate that you are using in the present value calculation, which is the market interest rate, the interest rate that people are generally using in the real world. But then there's the interest rate that you're actually using for this particular loan to calculate your interest payment. And that could be anything. Someone can tell you, well, the general interest rate is 5%. But on this loan, you're going to have to pay me 6%. Well, why would they do that? Are they being mean? Well, maybe. But actually, what they will say to you is, you have a terrible credit rating. I need to make up for the risk of lending money to someone with a terrible credit rating. I'm willing to take that risk, but you're going to have to pay me a higher interest rate than the general market rate. On the other hand, and this is actually the amortization schedule for the first example we just went over, maybe the present value is not more than the amount of the loan. Maybe the present value here, 666, is less than the value of the loan. Once again, the differences occur because the market interest rate, which the textbook author calls the effective interest rate, is not less than what you're paying on this particular loan. It's more than what you're paying on this particular loan. Well, why would the lender basically give you a break and charge you less than the market interest rate on the loan? And the answer most commonly is the lender is trying to give you a break. The lender wants to do business with you in the future. And so is saying, I want to please you. I want to give you a better than market deal. I will give you a lower interest rate than the market. Okay. Rule. When the interest rate on the particular loan that we're talking about which is called often the face interest rate because it's printed on the face of the loan itself. When the interest rate on this particular loan is less than the market rate, the present value, 666, will be less than the face value of the loan. On the other hand, when the face interest rate, what you're actually paying on this particular loan, is more than the market rate, then the present value will be more than the value of the loan. Okay, I'll say that a second time and then a third. When face value on a specific loan is less than market value, present value is less than face value of loan. On the other hand, down here, when the face interest rate that you're paying on a specific loan is more than the effective market rate, then the present value will be more than the market value on the loan. And I promise to say it a third time. So one more time. Face interest rate less than market interest rate, present value of loan less than face value of loan. Conversely, face interest rate more than market interest rate, present value of loan more than face value of loan. Now, what's happening here? What's happening here is that the present value of the loan is what the loan is really worth to people on the outside market. And remember, this is a bond, which means that the lender is about to sell your debt to the outside market. And so what the lender is thinking is, if I can get you to pay me more than the market is worth, well, let me say it again. If I can get you to pay me an interest rate that's more than what people in the market are generally paying right now, then when I go to sell this debt to the market is going to say, wow, this debt has a 6% interest rate. That's better than most debt on the market right now. This debt that you want to sell to me is actually worth a lot. And they will bid up the price to $735. On the other hand, if the rate of the specific loan is lower than what the market loans of that type typically are paying right now, then when the person who's holding the bond receivable tries to sell it to the market is going to reply, wait a minute, the person who's paying you on the loan is only paying 6%? Hey, buddy, market rate right now is hovering around 7%. This is not a very attractive loan to buy from you. I don't care if its face value is 700. It's not a very attractive loan to me. I'm only going to give you 666 for it. If the rate that is actually being paid on the loan looks bad in comparison to the market rate, if it looks bad, its value is going to be relatively low. On the other hand, if the rate that is currently being paid on the loan looks good in comparison to the market rate, the market is going to think highly of it, and the present value, the value of the loan from the market's perspective, is going to be relatively high. Okay, let me stop. Questions about that? Okay, it's just mechanics, and it's almost like simple rules and arithmetic, but it's literally the way the bond markets work. So it is helpful information. Okay, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit and cover 14-7. So these will be, let me yellow highlight this, and I will upload this version of this document to Canvas. That will be the topic of our next quiz on Thursday this week in 2 days, 4, 7, and 9. Just to backtrack to number 7, I just wanted to mention this to you. I looked at this at first glance and I said, wait a minute. Let's look at this outstanding balance. If you look here, originally the present value 735, and it goes down to 700 by the life of the loan. Okay, sounds reasonable. I looked up here and I said, wait a minute, I am not understanding something. According to this, when the loan was first issued, it was only worth 247, but it was actually a 1900 loan. Wait a minute, is that like a discount of like 1653? I mean, I've seen some really dramatic present value calculations in my time, but I rarely see a $1,900 payment present valued all the way down to 247. That's a heck of a difference between the value of the eventual payment and the original present value. And at first I thought, I must be missing something. And it turns out I wasn't, because this is a ridiculously, but apparently real world extreme situation where Coca-Cola borrowed money in 1995. They didn't have to pay off the loan until 2020. So they borrowed money and they kept it for 25 years and then repaid the loan. The interest rate that they were paying all along was nothing. And while the market interest rate was 8.5%. And so if you have this unbelievable, I mean, this is a huge difference between the face interest rate on the loan, which is not only very small, it's literally zero. And the market rate of 8.5, which is a little bit I mean, it's fairly high. And if you have this gigantic difference between the cash interest rate on the loan and the market rate, and on top of that, if that difference is going to be locked into place for 25 years, then yeah, these extreme circumstances will lead to an extreme present value calculation where the present value of a number this big is actually this small. But it's only because of the extremities of these factors that I just mentioned. For the most part, as you're going through these problems, not just on my next quiz, but in the real world, please keep in mind the extent of the difference between the present value and the original value of the loan really looks something more like this. It's usually 735 versus 700. Or as we saw in the early example, 666 versus 700. It's not usually 247 versus 1,900. Okay, questions about this material, 14-7. Questions about any of the material that we reviewed today? Going once? Going twice? And okay, it's 4 minutes early. I hope you do something fun with the next 4 minutes. I will stick around, but class is officially dismissed. Thank you for hanging in there, guys. Once again, let me request, remember, if you think that the video experience on chapter 20, the final chapter, was either significantly better or worse than doing things the way we usually do, please do let me know. Shoot me an email, chat with me after class if it's more convenient. Your feedback is always extremely helpful. And with that, class is officially dismissed. Take care, and I'll see you in a couple days. And okay, guys, so with that, any post class conversation, questions, thoughts, comments? Dawn, go right ahead. And
Can you hear me?
yep, now I can.
Okay, great. I just wanted to say that the videos help because I do so much in a week sometimes that